Okay, today we're in John 1. Absolutely a tremendous chapter of the Bible. I read it and I think about it, and I think this just has to be one of the greatest, if not the greatest chapter there is in the Bible. As we look at Matthew, Mark, and Luke, they introduce us to Jesus Christ, and they start out rather slowly. They start out with the genealogy of where he's going to come from. Then they introduce us to Mary and the angel coming and talking to her. And then they introduce us to John the Baptist, his birth. And then they introduce us to Christ, and he comes into the world. But when you turn to the book of John, John just starts out with, bang! Somebody jumped. That's the way he did it. He just started out with a great big explosion. In the beginning was God. And my, oh my, the wonderful things that he has to say. Now, we've all looked at the news and we've seen, that 80 seconds around the world. So let's take 80 seconds and go from heaven to earth and all around the world to see what we've already learned here in these first 5 verses in here. We have the introduction given to us, and he's called the Logos. Then we take a look at the beginning, in the beginning, and we learn that that is very back in the beginning of time, back at the beginning of our creation. We learned about the existence of the people that were there, and we learned at that time that it was God who was deity, and he was in existence. And he's called the I am who I am. We've learned that that means really everything, and later then that term is translated into Jehovah when we talk about Jehovah. Then we also learned that back in the beginning, before there was ever heaven and earth, there was also deity, and it was the Logos, and that is what's going to be Jesus Christ. We learned that he was back there, he was with God, he was God, in the beginning with God. Then we also learned that as you take a look at this Logos, Jesus Christ, that he is the creator of all things. And to make it so that any of us can understand, there's not one thing that has been created that was not created through him. Then we learned that as he created things, that he also gave them life. Now, to put that in perspective, we can understand that human beings have a lot of creative abilities. Now, we cannot create the way God did, that is, by bringing something out of nothing. But we can take what God has given us, and then we can make a whole lot of new things. Man can make hundreds and hundreds of millions and billions of new objects. But there's one thing that he cannot do, regardless of how beautiful the painting is, regardless of how wonderful and beautiful that automobile of gems is, regardless of anything about it. They make a statue of a human being. They can make the most handsome men and beautiful women, but they cannot give them life. But in Jesus Christ was life. And then in him, the life was also the light. And that is that he shed light in this world. Without him, nobody would know how to conduct themselves. We wouldn't know the purpose of life. We wouldn't understand why we're here. We wouldn't understand how to walk. We wouldn't understand the right and wrong of things. And it is through Jesus Christ then that we find he's the light of men. Then we come down to the new material today, and down in about verse 6. Here we find a new thing that is introduced to us. And this is going to be that there came a man by the name of John. And this is going to be John the Baptist. Now, as John the Baptist is introduced to us, we want to understand that the purpose of this gospel is to show that Jesus is the Christ. And keeping with that purpose, that's the only purpose. Why are we going to talk about John the Baptist? There's only one reason, and that is to show us that Jesus is the Christ and how great he is. So we pick up our story there in order to see about the greatness of Jesus by studying about John the Baptist. Now, when we take a look at John the Baptist, it said there was a man sent by God whose surname was John. Now, let's just get acquainted with John for just a moment. John came on the scene 6 months before Jesus did. We know that because in Luke chapter 1, verse 36, why, there it says in the 6th month there of Elizabeth's pregnancy. Now, Elizabeth is John the Baptist's mother. In the 6th month of her pregnancy, that's when Mary became with child. And so John then was born 6 months before Jesus was born. Now, John came and he began to preach. And by the time that Jesus stepped on the scene to preach, John had many disciples. There were many people who were following John. Now, John had one purpose in this life, and that was to prepare the Jewish nation for the coming of the Christ. So he went out and he was preaching to these people that they needed to repent, for the kingdom of God is at hand. And people began to flock to John. They came out to hear John preach. And John's whole message was, there's one who is coming after me, who was before me. And he's telling about how great this one is going to be. Now, John was a man with many disciples. Kind of hard for us to comprehend today, but stop to think, if there was a man in the political realm that was absolutely adored by the American people. Here's a man that nobody has ever seen the equivalent of. That everybody looks at him and he's undoubtedly the greatest person who's ever lived. He must be a prophet. And there's no prophet greater than he. And you look at this man and people flock out to get instruction from him, the smartest, greatest man who's ever lived. So they flocked to John. And when they flocked to him, the message was, I'm not the one. I'm here to tell you about the one who is coming. Now, these people even thought that John was the Messiah. And can you think about a politician today who is so great that the whole population thinks he is the Messiah? He's the greatest that ever happened. And so that's what they thought. And John spent his time saying, no, I'm not the Messiah. Get ready. He's coming right behind me. Now we ask, who was John? A very interesting question about that. John was just a normal man. He was not the Christ. He was sent or commissioned by God. Now, he was special. He was the one man in all the earth that God had chosen for a particular job. And we're going to find that job next week. And it was an awesome job. We're going to find some of it today. But it was an awesome job. Now, how great would an individual be if he's the only man God in heaven has commissioned to do a certain thing? That was John the Baptist. Now, he was sent by God for a specific purpose. That purpose is going to be to introduce Christ to the world. Now, we're going to learn some wonderful things about him today. We're going to learn some great things about John the Baptist. But I want you to hold it till next week. And next week, we're going to learn one big thing of how John introduced Jesus to the world so that there's no question about it. Now, John's purpose on this earth was to bear witness. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. He was to bear witness of the Christ to come. Now, he was an agent to make people believe. That was his job. His job was to make people believe in someone else. Now, you can look back at the synoptics and you read them, and the job of John was an awesome job. And so we're not trying to belittle him. We're trying to show you how great John was. Jesus one time said, "What did you go out in the wilderness to see? A prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and much more than a prophet." I'm going to tell you that John was great. None hath been born of woman greater than John. He was a great man. That's why he's introducing us. So we're going to take the greatest man in all the world, the greatest man that had ever been born, and we're going to see how he was related to Jesus Christ. And that will show us how great Jesus Christ is. Now, as we compare Christ and John, I want us to notice in this realm these particular things before we turn to the text. Christ was from all eternity. Remember, he was back in the beginning. John came. John came into the world just like you and I came into the world. Christ is the Word. That is, he's the 100% of God's desires. John is a man. The Christ is divine. He is God, 100%. John is a man who is commissioned by God. Christ is the true light. He's the only source that we can go to find how really to live. John is a witness of the light. Christ is the object of faith. He's the one that we are to believe in. After all has been said and done, after we have scanned our Old Testament from beginning to end, we've read all of those magnificent prophets and how over 300 times they pointed down there to what was going to happen. We finally came to John the Baptist, and John came, and he's the greatest of all. But what was the message of everybody? Everybody from the Garden of Eden down to John was, keep looking, there's one who is coming who is great. Now, let's look here just a moment about an illustration of what John was. It said in verse 6, "There came a man sent from God whose name was John. The same came for witness, that he might bear witness of the light, that all might believe through him." Now let's spend just a moment to think about this great man, John. And what was he? He was a witness. I'm trying to think of ways to explain. And here's a good way, that if you take the earth and the sun and the moon, every night the earth is spinning, the sun goes down, what we say, and it becomes dark. What happened to the sun? Where is it? Oh, now don't get smart with me. Yeah, all of us know today the sun is around on the other side of the earth, don't we? Suppose you had lived back at that time. Where's the sun? Every day the sun disappears. Every day the sun goes somewhere else. Every day it becomes dark, and we call it night. Is the sun still shining? Yeah, we know it is today because we have TV that shows us certain things. We have the Hubble telescope. But as you look at it, was the sun still shining? Well, the sun was shining on the other side of the earth, and that goes up and hits the moon, and the moon reflects the light down on the earth. So every night when you go out and you look at the sun, and it's all lit up, and there's sunlight where you can walk. Where'd that moon get its light? There is no light within the moon. It's dead. It's made of dust. There's not even one blade of grass on the moon. Not even a weed that's on the moon. It's dust. And yet it's light, and it gives us light. Where does it get its light? It gets its light from the sun. The sun's down there over Australia, and the sun is shining, and it hits the moon, and the light is reflected down, and we look up and we see the moonlight. That is reflected light. And what does that tell us? It's a witness. Every night the moon is a witness that the sun is shining. How do we know the sun is shining in Australia? By listening to the witness. We see the light coming down, and there it is. We can get it down this way. I thought this morning, there might be a better way of doing this because guys like Oliver might not be able to understand this. Oliver talks about the speed of light and studies astronomy all the time. Maybe this is too deep for him. So we say, what could you do? Okay, I want to show you one. I'm going to show you two things. First of all, I'm going to show you where it's the first time in my life I've ever failed. It's going to be a failure. But the idea is good. And it's going to show us what it is. I went in and I thought, how could I show this just in the auditorium? So I go in and I pick up my wife's mirror. And I go in and pick up a flashlight. I thought, all I've got to do is just shine this flashlight there in that mirror and then bounce it off the ceiling. And so I tried it at home. Yeah, there's the light. There it is. So I brought it down to show you how smart I am. Here's a light. Here's Christ. Here's a mirror. Here's John the Baptist, except there's too much light in here and it won't work. See, that's what I mean. It's failure, but you know what I mean. We've all seen the sun shine in and hit our wristwatch and send some light over there. Okay, here it is. Here's John the Baptist. Here's Jesus Christ. Here's the source of light. Now, if you were out in the woods and you were lost in the middle of the night and it's raining and cold, and I come out and say, hey, I have two things. I have my wife's mirror. You want it? Or I have a flashlight. Which would you rather have? We can see. Here's the important thing. You'd throw the mirror away. Why? Because the mirror doesn't give off light. It just reflects the light. And that's what John the Baptist did. John didn't give off light. John reflected the light. And that's how much greater Jesus Christ is than John the Baptist. So John the Baptist is a reflector. He's the witness that Jesus Christ is the light. Now, an interesting thing happened. And that interesting thing that happened is that Christ came to this earth. He came to this earth, and we're told in verses 9 and 10, and there was the true light, even the light which lighteth every man coming into the world. So now Jesus Christ is the source of light, and he's the one that lighteth or giveth instruction to every man cometh into the world. Anybody coming into the world that wants to know how to live, they're going to get it somehow or another through Jesus Christ. Now somebody might say, well, I've never studied the Bible. I've never, even as a child, opened the Bible. I've never been to church, and yet I have some good morals. Oh, is that right? Yeah. Were your mom and dad, they ever study the Bible? Or did their grandpa or grandma ever study the Bible? Anybody in the background ever studied that taught you, hey, son, don't do this? There's not an atheist in the world that hasn't had their mom or dad, grandpa or grandma somewhere to say, that's not nice, that's naughty, don't you do that. Don't you know you need to treat your friend the way you want them to treat you? Where did all that stuff come from? What I'm trying to say is this. There's not one sentence of how to live that exists in this world that hasn't come to us from the great God in heaven through Jesus Christ. That's what it's saying. He's the light that lighteth every man. How does any man know whether it's right or wrong to do these things? He is the light of the world. And if you show me a man that has never heard of Jesus, and there are, they've never been taught about Jesus, and there are, they've never, and so you go on and we build up this great scenario. How did they get this understanding? Well, I don't care who it is. They might not personally have been taught, but I'm telling you somebody else has taught what Jesus Christ had to say. Whether it's the Buddhist in China or Islam or whatever it is, there's nobody that hasn't stood under the light of Jesus Christ. He lighteth every man that cometh into the world. Then it says, John here was not the light, but came that he might bear witness of the light. There was the true light that lighteth every man coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world knew him not. This is an interesting statement. Here it is, Jesus Christ, the creator of the world. He came into the world, and the world, same world that was made through him, he made us. He made every rock, every tree, every human being, and the world knew him not. So when he came, the people went on in their own selfish way, not realizing that he was the divine Son of God. I just stopped to think in those years while Jesus was here upon the earth, how he walked down the street and he walked among men, how many times he spoke to them, good morning, and they'd say good morning, how many things he did, and all the time, none of these people knew there's the Creator. There's the one who made the world. The world didn't know him. The world didn't understand that he was the one. Now it said he came to his own, and they that were his own received him not. What does that mean? Well, in the world, there are two groups of people. There were the Jews, who were his own, and there was the Gentiles, all the other nations. Now he came to the Jews. He not only came to the world that he had created, but he even came to the Jews, the Jewish nation that he had developed, and they rejected him. The Jews rejected Jesus Christ. They didn't receive him. But it says, and here in his own people, well, first of all, I want to point this out. In the Greek, it says, he came into his own things. It's kind of interesting. It's a way that they have of putting it so you can tell the difference between things and people. He came into his own things. Jesus came down into his own things. Rocks, trees, mountains. He came down into the creation. And even his own people, the Jewish nation, they did not receive him. Of course, they rejected him and put him to death. It says, but as many as. Now, out of these people, as many as received him, we're going to see what he did. To them, he gave the right or the authority to become children of God. Again, that's another interesting word. Your translations may say power or right or authority. Again, in his language, they had really three words for power. You can translate it in as power. They had that word dynamite, which means that the power is inherent within the object. They had another word that means that you have this big object that has accumulated power. It would be like a D8 bulldozer or a 500-pound giant full of muscle and strong. But then there's another one with power, and it means authority. So now you could have a little 3-foot person, and he could have authority. He could be elected President of the United States. He doesn't have a lot of power within him. He doesn't have a lot of power without him. But he has a lot of power as far as authority is concerned. That's this word. Now Christ gave man authority. What authority did he give? He gave authority to do a certain thing. Let me illustrate it this way. You all know I'm a rich man. So much money that I just don't know what to do with it. So, suppose I come up with you and tell you, hey, how would you like to get into my bank account? How would you like to go in there and take out whatever you want? And you, well, yeah, wow. How do I do that? Woo. Now I could say, well, I'm going to give you authority. I'm going to give you the authority. And so I write down, give you authority, your name, tell the bank, put his name down on here, give you my bank account. You're standing there. All you've got's a piece of paper. You've got all this, but you have something else. You have authority. But until you go down to the bank and fill out the paper so that you can sign checks on my account, until you go through that system, you don't have the authority to do it. You're holding the authority in your hands, but you can't write a check. So I could say, well, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to give Mitch the authority to enter my bank account and take whatever he wants. So, what I do? I gave him the piece of paper. I gave him authority to go get into my bank account. Now, Christ gave people authority. If you receive Christ, if you accepted him, what would that have meant? Well, what was John the Baptist teaching all during his life? John the Baptist was out teaching, repent ye, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. There's one coming after me, greater than I, and he's going to be the Messiah. And he baptized them into a group of people who were watching and they were waiting. And finally, when the Messiah came, some of the Jews said, here he is. There were 3,000 on the day of Pentecost. Oh, here he is. You remember what they did when they accepted him? They said, men and brethren, what shall we do? That's just like Mitch. When I tell him I'm going to give you authority to get in my bank account, his first question will be, Lowell, what shall I do? How do I go about it? See? Well, that's what they said. So, as many as received him, as many who accepted him as the Christ, who believed in him, in his message, he gave them the authority. Now, the authority to do what? As many as received him, he's going to give them authority, and it's going to tell us, first of all, what receive means. Even to them that believe on his name. Now, there's your 3,000 in the 2nd chapter of the book of Acts. They're the ones who received him. Then, believe on his name, who were born. Now, then we're going to give them authority to be born right here. He said in here, and he came into his own, which was not. But as many as received him, he gave the right to become children of God, even to them who believe on his name. So you have the authority to become children of God. Now I want to play with this just a moment. I want you to see the whole point. There are people that say the moment that you believe Jesus is the Christ, you're saved. We know that, 97%, 99% of the religious world will tell you that. The moment that you believe, or have you accepted Christ in your heart? Have you received Him? Yeah, then you're saved. This said, no. Whenever you believe on Jesus Christ, whenever you accept Him and receive Him, and you believe on Him, then you are given the authority to become children of God. Now, what that means is that if you don't believe on Him, you don't have the authority or the right to become children of God. Suppose we take two men. They hear Scott preach. He's preaching Jesus is the Christ. Neither one of them are believers. At the end of the lesson, one man's heart is pricked, and he said, I believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God. The other one says, well, I don't. I think he was a good man, but I don't. They both come forward at the end of his sermon. He asked him, he said, what would you like to do? And this one man says, well, you have convinced me. I'm convicted. I believe that Jesus is the Christ, and I want to become a child of God. What will Scott say? Okay. Do you know what to do? He says, no. Scott says, well, and then he explains how you become a Christian. He goes to the other guy and says, you heard the same sermon. What do you want to do? He said, I want to become a Christian. I want to become a child of God. Okay, do you believe Jesus is the Christ? Do you accept Him? No, I don't think He's a Christ. I think He was an awfully good man. But I want to become a Christian. What would Scott say? You can't. There's no way you can become a Christian. I'm going to baptize this man for remission of sins, but even if I baptize you, you can't become a Christian. I'm going to baptize this one man one time, and all of his sins will be forgiven, and he'll become a Christian. But sir, I'll stay down here all afternoon and keep baptizing you 500 times, and you still can't become a Christian. Why? Because you don't have the authority. It's just like Mitch can take my sheet up the bank, and he has the authority to withdraw my funds, but Oliver sees Mitch do it, and he goes up and says, hey, I want some of Lowell's money. What do they tell him? Well, do you have the authority? What do you mean? I want some just like Mitch wants some. What, do you have the authority? And you see, he doesn't have the authority, and it doesn't make any difference how many checks Oliver writes on my bank account. He's not going to get a dime. And that's the way it is in becoming a child of God. There's where we have to close today, right in the middle of a great section. Okay, class dismissed.